Like we talked about, there's a lot of titty play in this movie. Hi everybody, this is Ara.
And Liberty.
We just watched The Black Cauldron. Hot take, what did you think?
Almost 3 stars.
Did it stand up to what you remember?
Yeah, I didn't really have any outstanding memories, and it was equally forgettable this time around.
Like the second time around, yeah. This is my first go of it, and I would agree it's pretty forgettable.
Yeah, the thing that stood out to me the most was, 1, there was a psychic pig, and 2, I'm in love with Eilonwy. However you say her name.
Let's talk about the psychic pig. I think that the psychic pig doesn't get a lot of play.
I don't think the psychic pig gets enough play either. I think I'm just attracted to that
Big human eyes.
Yeah, she has those big human eyes, and she reminds me of my dogs.
I mean, I know that that's all Disney animal characters, but for whatever reason, it weirded me out a little bit.
Really?
Like the human eyes, I was like...
Her eyes look especially human because she has eyelashes.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's for sure.
Oh my god, and she has eyebrows
like,
too.
In this one... It's weird, right?
I kind of like it because she's a psychic pig. I feel like being a little more human fits in with that.
I think the character works, I guess. Let's talk about the other character. You mentioned Eilonwy.
My lady love.
So it's interesting. The character has that really high-pitched voice that I associate with the really old Disney princesses. Like Sleeping Beauty and maybe Snow White. Those are worse, but those are way older. I'm willing to give those more of a pass, but when I compare it to like Robin Hood and Jungle Book, which I think are still older than this, the characters in that feel to me more, and I mean this vocally, but they feel more animated. You know, they're more distinctive. But it's just uninteresting. She's just got her like skinny.
Wait, what happened to her magic orb? Like I remember.
Oh shit, you're right. The magic orb was like
there in the dungeon, and then I couldn't follow the movie
no, you're
enough
totally
to know
right.
what happened to it.
I wonder if there was this particular point where she lost it, or if it just kind of dropped off screen at some point. Because the orb was actually really cool. It sort of gave her something about her that was nice. As soon as she shows up, she's really conversational, which is weird because she's like alone in this castle. But it sort of makes sense with the orb because the orb is like kind of sentient a little bit. I did actually like the orb. If I had to list one character that was my favorite, it would probably be the orb. You know what it reminds me of is Tinkerbell. Tinkerbell is of course more expressive, but she doesn't speak and is like a similar kind of glowing flying thing.
The orb doesn't have like any
expression. It
or
gets a little bit.
Really.
It does with the colors.
Would you consider the orb an extension of herself because it's like her accessory? Is it reflective of her, or is it a separate entity?
I perceived it as a separate entity.
That's interesting to me because I perceived it more as something that was an extension of her and herself. And I think the orb makes her more attractive.
To me, it was more of like a sidekick. So it reminds me of almost like an R2-D2 or a BB-8. Again, it's like a non-verbal character that has some expressive-ness to it.
Yeah. I think part of the reason I didn't even notice it disappear is just because I assumed it absorbed back into her because it's her orb. It's part of her. It's inside her.
It's hard to answer this question and I don't remember what happened to the orb.
Well, looking at the internet, I can't figure out what happened to the orb either.
So maybe it just...
In the books, she offers the orb to the witches in exchange for the Black Cauldron, and they deny the request, but I have no idea what happens to it in the movie.
The orb was great. I wish it had got more play. In fact, that would have been more interesting if the orb was offered to the witches, because it has some sentience to it. It would be like losing a real character if the orb died or something like that.
Just so you know, I don't know if this will affect your perception of the orb's animation, but it is CGI. It's Disney's first animated feature film to incorporate CGI.
I think that's pretty cool.
For the orb and the bubbles and the boat they had.
That's actually really interesting. I think that's a good example of if you do bring in a new technology like CGI, then you get to do something cool that you might not have done otherwise. And
yeah, definitely. I'm thinking about all of those examples. Like, we couldn't tell, but I think those animated sequences stood out. That boat scene near the end. We were reading that Roger Ebert review where he called it rip-roaring. Did he say rip-roaring?
Yeah, rip-roaring. It was a rip-roaring adventure.
That's the only scene where I was like, yeah, that was a rip-roaring adventure.
Yeah, so it's funny you mentioned that as an animation thing, because one of the most standout shots in the whole movie was when you first see the orb, and it's the light source in the scene, and her shadow is being cast on the wall from the orb, and I was like, that actually is really cool to me, because when I think of modern CGI animation, what makes it feel realistic is often the lighting.
Yeah.
Because that's the kind of thing we catch with our eyes unconsciously, when we see the way light reflects off of things, and when that's off, that's one of those things that cues us into being like, this looks really unrealistic, and even though the was this hand-drawn animation that gave it a really realistic feeling to it. But as I mentioned when we were watching it, it obviously wasn't super advanced because the orb is the light source and it's shuffling around, but the shadows aren't moving with it. And it does throw off the realism a little bit, but still points given how old the movie is.
So the orb is your favorite character?
I think so, yeah.
And mine is the Mark Hamill lookalike, Gurgi.
Yeah.
The only person who turns me on in the movie more than Eilenwee is Gurgi. Because he looks like Mark Hamill.
I think you're turned on by a lot of the characters in this animated movie.
This movie was surprisingly sexual, and that was not one of the PG warnings. Something else we read was that this was Disney's first movie with a PG rating. Watching the movie, I think we probably would have assumed a lot of it had to do with the sexual imagery, but everywhere we read about the PG rating, it's the dark imagery and villain.
As far as the sexual imagery goes, like we talked about, there's a lot of titty play in this movie. There's like a whole scene where the frog is like lost in her bosom.
And she's like rubbing up against that old man and he rejects her.
Do you think that adds something to the movie?
Adds adult depth to it? Like, I don't know.
Separate questions. Does it make it more fun for adults and does it add anything for the kids?
I don't think it really adds fun to the adults unless they're adults like us.
Yeah, so I don't find it actually sexy in the way that maybe some future Disney...
Well, one of the reviews I was reading was actually pretty critical of that scene where she's rubbing up against the old man and he rejects her because it's not sexy and she is a heavy woman. That just goes into the portrayal of heavy women being over-sexualized, but as a way to point out their lack of desirability.
I will say I can appreciate from a future perspective the sexual character being not skinny, but...
She gets rejected. Yeah. She kind of like undermines it.
Yeah, definitely undermines it.
Looking at any movie that has a fat person and where they're a villain and being like, oh, that's representation, but it's like...
True. They're kind of villains. They like help the heroes. They're more like...
They're morally gray characters.
Yeah,
we compared them to the Fates from Hercules, and I would stick by that comparison in terms of their position with good versus evil.
To me, I still think, I mentioned this while we were watching, but they really just reminded me of the three witches from Hocus Pocus.
I definitely got that in terms of like the balance between them, and even the voices really reminded me of that, even though I've never seen Hocus Pocus all the way.
Like in Hocus Pocus, there's like the leader one, the stupid one, and the sexy one.
The stupid one in this movie just doesn't talk, but
So she doesn't get as much play, but I'm not going to let you get out of this without telling me more about the Gurgi Mark Hamill situation.
Well, I don't want to be like explicit about how I feel about Mark Hamill. Mark Hamill's so hot. Like...
Yeah, okay, sure. You can have that one. I'm not going to fight you on that. But...
And Gurgi reminds me of him.
That's what I'm going to fight you on. I don't...
At first I was like, yeah, he looks like Mark Hamill in episode 8. But what he reminds me of is Mark Hamill in interviews when he smiles and is charming.
So that's the thing, is I don't find Gurgi charming at all. I don't find him funny or just annoying.
So you picked up on the fact that Gurgi sounded a lot like Gollum. The source material, literary critics have said that character of Gurgi, speech pattern, the way he's written, is a lot like Gollum. It's been directly compared to that character just through the writing. He's not charming, but the way Disney portrayed him, the character design they used, visually makes me think of Mark Hamill and how hot he is.
Okay, yeah, he's got this shaggy hair and similar color. I grant you that.
If you hit mute on the Black Cauldron and you just watch Gurgi's scenes, would you not be like, wow, this has some real Mark Hamill energy?
No, I don't think I would.
When I think of Mark Hamill, I think of someone who's overexcited and a little frenzied, and that kind of design was in Gurgi too. And he has the shaggy hair and similar coloring, and I know Mark Hamill's eyes aren't as bright blue, but in my head they are when I imagine him underneath me.
Ooh, that's a lot. I don't know if I can add anything to this conversation, but there's one more character I think we should talk about. What did you think of the villain?
Nothing. A huge reason why this movie is forgettable is because the villain is forgettable. You only see him from the waist down for a long part of the movie until he's finally revealed when they have Henwen and Yukan up. And the score indicates that that's supposed to be a big reveal, but it just isn't. And I wonder if that's just because we've been desensitized and that character design was maybe more striking in the 80s. I just also agree with you when you say that he doesn't really have enough character to the way he's written.
Disney villains that come after him are definitely more fleshed out or less two-dimensional.
But then you also brought up Maleficent, which is much older and doesn't really have a backstory. Her lines, though, are much more menacing. Her character design just feels more menacing.
Her look is a lot more iconic. She's a similarly just
Which is interesting because he's the Horned King, and I think they probably drew on her design. Do you feel like his army made him more or less menacing?
Definitely less, because they didn't do anything.
They weren't that threatening. He has his little goblin sidekick. You thought that was really reminiscent of Pain and Panic. And if you think of Hades, that's like way less interesting.
Because he wasn't funny.
He was intended to be funny. Let's say that. And if we just look at that execution, there's really that conflict there between the raucous partying in his cavernous kingdom. You see all his people with their drinking and their meat and their sexy dancers. Like, that's really a stark contrast.
That's the thing about the skeleton army, is you don't get to see them do anything. But looking at Hercules as an example, the army is the Titans, but before the Titans are defeated, they pretty much overthrow all of Mount Olympus. And even before they get to Mount Olympus, they destroy a bunch of the Greek villages and stuff. So you're like, oh, these are really powerful. Defeating them is going to be difficult. There's some satisfaction to it. But there doesn't seem to be any world building in this movie. I don't get a sense of what exists outside of this castle. The entire movie takes place essentially in the castle or underground near the castle, and we basically go straight to it from his little farm. Is there a village? Is there
I think this is part of the problem. The different settings there were and the sense of travel that's supposed to take place is never really impressed upon us.
This is your classic story, like there's a villain, the world is at stake. But if I don't have a picture of what world is at stake, we don't even know where these skeletons are marching to. Like we don't know what
does he want power
what is
over.
going to be lost.
Like we have Ailonwi as a princess.
Oh, right.
Yeah, she's Princess Ailonwi, but you never get a sense of like, oh, this is her kingdom we're in.
Right.
Or that's a kingdom 2 kingdoms away.
And even in something like Sleeping Beauty, it's not like there's a ton of world building, but it's established that there is a kingdom.
There's a kingdom, she has a family.
Right. Yeah, we have some sense of like this maleficent person, what she could destroy. In this, it's just like, oh, what is there?
It's just these 5 people, kind of.
It's interesting because John Hurt is voicing the character, but it's like, and I love John Hurt.
I love John Hurt too, but it's really forgettable. You can barely tell it's him.
Yeah. Well, I also want to ask, we brought up how it was PG, not because all the sexual content, but mainly because it's darker. Did you feel that it was darker than other Disney movies?
It's not really dark thematically, but it is dark aesthetically. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe in the 80s it's darker than other movies to warrant a PG rating. I mean, it's still only PG.
Yeah, I mean...
Which, if we think now, almost all movies are PG.
Sure, that's true.
Thinking about the movies around it, The Fox and the Hound and The Great Mouse Detective, I'd say compared to those, aesthetically, it is a darker movie with a degree more violence.
At the same time, I think to myself, we also compared it to Bambi, where something really dark happens. I know we're not just talking about this literally, but in the colors, this movie is literally a lot darker.
Yeah, which I think reflects kind of like the tone it takes.
There's the fairies, which bring in some color, but by and large, we're looking at a lot of black and gray tones throughout the film.
Even when they're not in the castle, the colors are really muted in this movie. Even when it's not dark, it's just not very vibrant.
That's what I liked about the orb, too. It brought some color, and color that was not just there to be colorful, but conveyed some emotion, but they just kind of dropped it off. Maybe it's possible that the animation was expensive if it was like early computer animation.
It's totally possible.
Maybe they were counting the pennies there.
This movie changed the way they approach their animation department.
So ultimately, how would you rate it among other Disney animated movies? Do you agree it's like one of the worst ones that you've seen?
No, I wouldn't call it that. Earlier you said that you really feel like it's out of time because you hadn't watched it.
Sure.
Now that you've watched it, do you still feel like it's out of time?
It's worse than all of the Disney movies that I can remember well.
I wouldn't want to give it the title of worst Disney animated movie I've seen. There's all the sequels.
Okay, we're not counting. We're not counting the sequel. I'm not gonna put this against like Lion King 1.5. You know what I mean?
I will, and I'll say that movie was probably worse, even though I don't remember it either.
Well, let me put it to you this way: if you ask me in like a year whether I'd want to rewatch this or Lion King 1.5, I'm almost certain my answer would be Lion King 1.5.
I wouldn't call it a good movie at all, but worse seems pretty far.
Yeah, maybe it doesn't deserve such a harsh title, but if I'm gonna be honest, it was a snooze fest.
Like I would never call it bad. It was just boring.
I think boring is bad. I think an animated movie for children can't be both boring and good. I can think of a few movies that are a little bit boring but have a lot of artistic value, but this isn't bad.
Part of it for me is like I did watch this as a kid and I don't remember thinking it was boring as a kid.
Well, I think a modern kid would, but that's maybe not fair.
I think my kids would be more open-minded to accepting this movie as something interesting. Me and my kids would have a very lengthy discussion about how hot Ailonwi is.
Again, it's maybe so unfair to compare this to newer characters, but if we're talking about the attractiveness of the character, Disney's got better shit coming in the next couple decades. I mean, I think it's telling that in our excitement started talking about more interesting films than The Black Cauldron and
Would you call this the worst Disney animated movie you've seen? I wouldn't blame you if you said yes.
It's the worst that I can remember as vividly as this one, which is, again, maybe unfair. I just watched this one. Is there one that you can think of that you would say is worse?
The thing is, I think there's probably a worse one, but I don't know, it's forgotten to history.
I think Black Cauldron was forgotten to history.